Okay, so it looks like everyone's had a chance to log in, so let's get started today. Um, Hi, I'm Jim Carter. I'm a managing director at Huron Consulting, and I'm going to be the moderator today for the webinar that's on budgeting and cost analysis for animal research facilities. In advance, I'd like to thank UCLA for participating, the Department of Lab Animal for assisting with us. Before we start, I just want to do a couple logistical items. The first one is we are recording today's session, and the slides are going to be embedded in that, and that's going to be made available if you want to share it with other people. At the end, we will have a Q&A session, so if you want to hold your questions till then, or you can post them, and we'll try to walk through and answer them. So with that, I'd like to go through the topics or the agenda for today. So the first thing, we'll introduce the rest of the Huron team and UCLA that's going to participate. Then we're going to be talking about budgetary considerations, which is just, the overall impact of animal rates. Talk about the animal rate overview, which is really sort of the how. The model overview, which is really how we take the CARS manual, which is the guidance that we receive from the federal government to develop the rates. The most important part of it is the time and motion study, which is really the allocation of labor. And so we're going to dig in there, and UCLA is going to share share their approach. Then last, we'll just go through the rate calculation that we helped UCLA conduct, and then we'll have our Q&A. So with that, let's start with the introductions. So I've already talked about myself a little bit. Part of the research services practice was within Huron. I have, 35 years. I can't believe I can say that, but I've been around for a while. But with me today for Huron, I have Kari, Kelly, and Natalie. So Kari, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Jim. So I'm Kari Kelly. I'm a director in the research services practice within Huron. I myself have about 15 years of experience in research administration. My main focus has been working within the costing team, so I do a lot of F&A rate calculations, which is inclusive of space surveys, rate negotiations, and then I've kind of spanned out in the last 7-ish years and have done a lot of service center related work, and then really in the last 5 have done a lot of animal per diem rate calculations, and did assist with UCLA's. Natalie, did you want to introduce?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Hewitt. I've been in the consulting world for about 8 years, 5 of which has been with Huron in research administration. I've touched on a lot of the subject areas in research administration, from the clinical side with clinical trials and software there, all the way through interim staffing. And as of late, have been working really closely with Kari and Jim on some animal rate per diem calculation models with various institutions, and also helped UCLA with their calculation as well.
Thank you. And now from UCLA, Jeff? Dr.
Yeah, Jeff Goodwin here. I'm the executive director at Diem, the animal operation at UCLA, and I'm the campus veterinarian, one of 4 veterinarians here. I've been in the lab animal business for about 23 years total, and I've been a director at one place or another for about 12 or so years.
Thank you. Leanne?
Hi, I'm Leanne Hawes, and I'm the Chief Administrative Officer here in the Division of Lab Animal Medicine. I have over 30 years, so I'm up there with Jim. My role is budgeting and finance and participating in all of the cost analysis and rate setting over the years for our division.
I'm Sandra Duarte. I'm one of the veterinarians at Diem, and I'm also the Associate Director. I have been in this role for about 2 years, so my experience has been mainly clinical, but in the last 2 years, I have really been working on husbandry practices and efficiencies. So I did a lot of the work for the timing motions in that regard, and we will go into the details of that later.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm going to start here, just talking about UCLA's experience here. So I was actually a director at another institution, a smaller institution, before I came to UCLA. And it was at that institution that I kind of recognized the need to have like a per diem rate setting tool or some way to calculate those rates on a regular basis, because in order to make operational decisions, you need to know how things are going to affect the per diem rates. If I wanted to hire a new vet, if I wanted to switch to a cheaper feed or something like that, these decisions, obviously, for anyone in this business, know that these have repercussions for the researchers, et cetera. And if you don't know how that's going to affect the rates, you really don't. It's hard to make these decisions. So I know that a tool for rate setting is really important. When I came to UCLA, it was that kind of a, should we say, turbulent time when it comes to per diem rates. And so it was really clear to me that having a tool or developing a tool at UCLA was also very important. UCLA is a much larger, more complicated place. And so I didn't have, coming from a smaller place, it was just it was going to be a different experience. And so we talked about how we were going to develop a tool like this, and ultimately decided on working with Huron, which I think was the right thing to do. So, Lan, do you want to talk about our experiences?
Sure. I wanted to add to that over the years, we had conducted time and motion studies and had rate setting annually, but we didn't have a tool that connected everything. So we did use Excel, but these spreadsheets were not linked. And at the same time, when Jeff arrived, we were in the process of trying to acquire additional support from the campus, which made it perfect timing to have Huron come in and help us with getting this tool, redoing the time and motion study methodology, and so that's where we are now.
Thanks, Sandra.
So for me, the experience with Huron was, initially I was the person bringing up all the data related to husbandry and veterinary labor. And so I worked really closely with Natalie, bringing all that data to make sure that she has everything that she needed to complete the model. And later on at the end, I was working with her kind of like in quality checks of the model, making sure that we review the labor of every single one of the categories to make sure it was appropriate. So for me, it was a very, very good experience being the point of contact between Huron, Leanne, Jeff, and the husbandry supervisors. So that way, Natalie didn't have to communicate with 10 different people. It was me kind of like directing the information to her. So that was my experience in this process.
So thanks for that overview. I'd like to emphasize the fact that one of the, I think, key outcomes or important outcomes was the fact that the rates were presented to the faculty, and I think the faculty was happy with, the approach that was used, the data, and the final results. They're never happy with higher rates, but at least I think we're able to see that UCLA did their due diligence and could support the numbers that were come up with. So I think with that, we'll talk about the budgetary considerations.
Okay, so an annual per diem rate, when you think of budgeting with per diem rates, by analyzing your per diem rates on an annual basis, it's really going to provide greater transparency into multiple areas, and it also provides a full costed picture of the operations of your animal facility. So looking at the areas of greater transparency, expense allocation. So going through an animal per diem rate study, it's going to provide an insight into which animals or species are generating an abnormally higher operating expenses. So really looking at those expenses throughout the study and trying to assign them as much as possible directly to the species that they're attributable to. Sometimes this often will highlight species that the facility was unaware of are drawing a larger amount of salary-related costs too. Sometimes there's species that have higher enrichment costs. So this is going to provide greater transparency into that relationship between the expenses within the facility and the species that are being housed. when you think about the subsidy and the transparency that's provided, you're really going to have the opportunity to identify which species rates are closest to the true cost and which are going to need that higher subsidized amount to remain competitive in your market. So a lot of facilities you'll see are going to be primarily rodent-based, but then you might have species rolling in and out at various points of time throughout the year or year to year. And so those at some points are going to need to be subsidized more to remain competitive in that market. And then the time and motion study really allows visibility into your resource allocation and that duration of common activities for staffing purposes. So the time and motion is conducted to really give you a picture of how provide an allocation mechanism for salary and wages, which we'll discuss in more detail further in this presentation, but it also kind of gives you a picture of looking at your FTEs and you're looking at job titles and summarizing the various positions across the facility, and it allows visibility into what those positions are doing on a day-to-day basis. So understanding in all where each dollar recovered by a species originates, it's really going to allow more accurate budgeting based upon the anticipated census days in the future. So it's not uncommon for institutions that we have seen that are working with an outdated costing study and are adjusting rates based on an estimated cost inflation. We've seen facilities or that maybe haven't had the opportunity to conduct one recently and may just be inflating their per diem rates annually by a 2 or 3% increase. So some of the challenges when thinking about embarking on updating your per diem rates. Using outdated rates, it may perpetuate the use of rates calculated, not on a cost-based methodology. So what I was just describing is an institution's not aware of maybe when that last costing study was done, but just knows that, this is the process they've been using to remain competitive in the market. That may also be allowing you to not, or may cause the under recovery of some costs, knowing that you haven't gone through that cost rate calculation in some time. Collecting data, the data that's used for the calculation can be difficult. Some of this data may be still being tracked in a paper format. So that's, getting the data that you need to embark on the calculation is sometimes a step in itself. And then aligning data from different time periods can create inconsistencies in calculations. So again, thinking of, the species that you have regularly, but some that you do not. So you may want to calculate rates for species that are currently not in-house, but or expect to have in the future or have had in the past. Capturing time and motion data is labor intensive and may require paper forms. So that's typically one of the larger undertakings, is really trying to come up with that statistic from the time and motion, again, which we will discuss in more detail, but your salary and wages usually account for 70 to 80% of your animal facility. And so that's going to be where a lot of time is spent. And then quantifying the subsidy amount may not be possible or identified for individual species.
So we're going to have a polling question. We'll have some throughout. So first polling question is, how successful is your institution in implementing annual per diem rate changes? So we'll take a second for people to respond. I think the polling question will post up on your screen. So it looks like about 65% of the people are changing theirs yearly, and 30% intend to and never do. So thank you. With that, we'll move on to the next topic, which is going to be the per diem rate overview.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So what is a per diem rate? Per diem rate is the cost to care for an animal or a cage of animals for a single day. So when you think about that, this is inclusive of services that, you know, are going to vary by institution, which are typically defined under that standard of care. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you think of benchmarking or you look at the market or comparing your institution's rates to another, is what is that standard of care and what defines that? So sometimes you'll see that services included in a per diem rate are going to vary from one institution to the other. The per diem rate may include additional services or users who are billed based on the usage. So you're really looking at what are the total costs for the species, and then after, you know, aligning those, you're going to divide by the total care days, and that's ultimately what's going to get you your per diem rate. The cost analysis and rate, the CARS manual, is the official NIH guidance. The model that Huron uses was built to mimic the CARS manual. It follows the guidance and is compliant with it. And, you know, per the manual, costs should be analyzed annually and rates adjusted as necessary. So regulatory considerations, why update your per diem rates? So right at the top here is compliance. So per the NIH guidance that we just discussed, implementing a cost-based per diem rate, ensuring that they are cost-based, and so costs can vary and change from year to year. As a specialized service facility, animal rates are to be reviewed annually. And then you also are ensuring that your cost recovery is not being duplicated, things such as like equipment or IACUC related costs. Across campuses, you know, one of the things we saw with UCLA as well is just the transparency, improving transparency into the rate structure and calculation. So when you are communicating a rate increase, your campus users really understand why or where that is coming from. And so as Jim had mentioned, with the engagement with UCLA, we did have the opportunity to present the rates to a faculty group, which is going to be used as a mechanism of, you know, starting that communication campus-wide. So transparency is something that we're seeing within UCLA and other institutions of push as well when looking at updating their per diem rates. And then the simplified cost structure. So developing rates that are representative of costs and species. We often see that when we embark on a per diem rate calculation and you start looking at assigning and aligning costs, you think of the various functions and services, it could seem overwhelming or complex in the beginning, but then when you really start to look at the costs, which we'll talk more about as we get into the model and the allocation statistic used for them, you want to simplify that as much as possible. Common industry observations. So many institutions have not formally calculated rates recently, to my earlier point. And some institutions have not increased them in many years, so subsidizing the majority of the animal expenses. So if you don't have that true cost picture, you're not aware of what those true costs are, you could be under recovering them and subsidizing more than necessary.
Hey, thank you, Kari. We'll do another polling question. When was the last time your institution calculated per diem rates? The choices are 1 to 2 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, never, or I'm not sure. So we'll take a second for you to complete the poll. Thank you. So it looks like most of you are updating your 67% again, just like we said 1 to 2 years ago. And, you know, the few people, it's been 5 years or more than 10 years. So appreciate you responding to that. So So the next section we'll talk about is going to be a model overview.
Sure, thanks, Jim. So now that we know that some of you have calculated the rates in the last couple years, maybe some others are sweating that they haven't, kind of the next section will really cover where to start when you start looking at calculating that per diem rate. It seems a little overwhelming at first. You have all these animals, you don't know where your money could be, you potentially don't know where your money is going. So really just we're going to walk through a couple steps of things you want to pull in, information you want to look at, and how to start allocating that money down to the species level. To Kari's point, we do want to track as best we can a single dollar all the way from when we spent it down to which animal is going to recover that for us. So on the right-hand side, you'll see these are the 5 main data points and kind of groups of data that we look at when we're going through an animal per diem rate calculation. We'll look at everything from a full year of internal operating expenses, all of your census cage days, the payroll especially, and the labor stats, to Kari's point, and to the time and motion study, which we'll keep teasing you about until we get to that section. Those are going to be some of our biggest expenditures on the whole for a fiscal year. And then we'll also look at space when we're looking through the model, when you're trying to figure out where my animals live and is that space really conducive for things. So when we start looking at the expenses, we're going to look at a full fiscal year. And what we want to do is start allocating those expenses into what we call activity codes. So those are going to be directly related to animal welfare, whether that be animal husbandry, cage washing. We will have some general administration costs that we have, just, office supplies, telephones, that sort of thing. And what we want to do is start bucketing our money in different categories that we can really use to drive down and allocate out into the species level. So 4 major allocation methods you'll want to consider when taking your money at a big level and start funneling it down into each species. We have a direct assignment. If we know that the feed, we have our invoices tracked to the species level, we can automatically just drop that feed cost towards those species. We'll also use the animal care days and the census detail. We know institutions are very keen and need to report their animal care days a lot more regularly than they might calculate their per diem rates. So we have that information available for that full fiscal year. And what we'll do is we can allocate costs to those exact same proportions. So if we know that every animal and species uses a certain type of feed and bedding, we can allocate it across all of our species based on how many we had over the whole fiscal year. We also allocate on total assigned costs. Generally, our general administration costs touch all of our species, and therefore we will want all of our species to cover a portion of those costs as well. And lastly, that mysterious time and motion study statistic. This is where we're really going to understand what we do, what our people are doing, and with which species, so we can really base those allocation and that salary and wage dollars on those statistics.
Thank you. The third polling question, do you know what data drives your institution's animal per diem rates? Just a simple yes or no on this one. So 77% of you understand the calculation or how it works. So thank you. So Natalie, I think, is going to continue.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And so what you're seeing is kind of a general, very simple equation that Kari talked briefly through. And we started looking at kind of where you look at your money and how you bucket it. So we have our total expenses. We're going to pull out those adjustments that Kari was speaking on, the IACUC compliance per the CARS manual. You'll want to make sure that any regulatory costs or charges for the IACUC are pulled out. What we're calling technical services would be those services that maybe your vets are performing for a PI that you're already billing for the PI. So any pass-through costs or any charges that you're already recovering on a different invoice, we don't want to include in the expenses that we're using to calculate our per diem rates, because that would be considered a double recovery. And lastly, the capital equipment, if depreciation is included on your institution's F&A proposal, we won't want to include it here again for that double recovery consideration. So once we have all of our money, we've taken out the unallowable, what we're calling unallowable costs. That leaves us with a slightly reduced bucket of money that we can look at with salary and wages and the non-salary expenses. So we're going to take those monies, we're going to bucket them into what we're calling the activity codes. First, we'll put them into cost centers such as salary and fringe, feed, and bedding. So by accounts, you'll want to break those into cost centers so that you can group like with like, and then you can distribute that money, that like money, in a similar fashion. So from the cost centers, we'll move into the activity codes, and that will be where we'll start targeting what are our animal husbandry costs, what are we defining as animal health care, what activities and account level expenses are we seeing that we are getting charged, recovering on a different service level for those technical activities, and then kind of where is our money really setting in these activity code buckets. Once you have that distribution into those activity codes, we use those allocation statistics that we talked about earlier, whether it be the time and motion study, the census days, direct costs, and we're going to allocate it back down to the species level. So each species is going to have a certain amount of allocated expenses. When we divide that by the animal care days, we get our projected per diem rates, and these are the true cost rates. We do count them as true cost rates, even though we've taken out those unallowable costs, because those costs have been recovered elsewhere or not included as what we're considering an allowable cost. So once you have the per diem rates, the next slide just walks through some of those assumptions I talked about prior to that. You will want to consider working through any vacant positions. So we understand institutions and facilities are constantly changing. Jeff talked earlier about when you want to know what it's going to cost you and your operating expenses to hire a new vet. So you'll want to include that vacant position in your model going forward so you can recover those costs, anticipating that need ahead of time. The same can be said for if you know a big purchase of equipment might be coming up that's not going to be capitalized. You can put that into your calculation and see how that plays out through the model itself. One thing you might want to look at, and we helped UCLA do a little bit of this in other institutions, is combining some species rates. So it would be ideal that if every species had its own rate, but sometimes if we have a species on site only for a little bit, for a quarter of the year, that's going to get blown out of proportion potentially with the expenditure level that they're going to need, and therefore you might say their care is like another species standard of care and just use the larger species standard of care, the larger census presence species standard or rate as the smaller species. So you try to reduce or combine them as best as possible. It makes it a little bit easier on the accounting side, as well as knowing what rate to bill the PIs at. And lastly, any subsidies. We know that a lot of institutions receive a subsidy from various places within the school, and we understand that sometimes you want to subsidize explicitly certain expenses, or you just want to say at the end, here are our true cost rates. Really, our PIs can only handle about a 2 or 3% increase. Therefore, we have to subsidize everything else. But you do have that true cost rate. To Kari's point earlier about transparency, if this information is presented to your faculty, you can say, here's what the true rate is. I like to call it the sticker shock page. Here's what your true cost rate would be, and then we're going to subsidize it. And that gives you, the facility, a little bit of good faith, showing your PIs and your researchers and your administrators that, hey, we understand it's very expensive to have animal research on site, and we would like to keep animal research by subsidizing the rate so that we are competitive in the market and we can keep this in-house. So the next section, we're going to walk through the almighty time and motion study. What this is, it's really what are we doing with our time and which species are we using to go with it. So Kari mentioned earlier, 70 to 80% of our salary and wages of our operating expenses are salary and wages, and therefore it's very critical that we know where our time is spent and on which species. The next slide will walk through a couple different, or we'll walk through kind of the two types of time and motion studies that we see and we recommend, but who do we want using the time and motion study? We'd ideally like everyone that's supported on the animal facility payroll, so even your administrators even anyone that doesn't even touch the animals, but if they're on the payroll, we'll want to know where they're spending their time. We could assume that they're all going to general administration time, but you might have a IACUC protocol here and there, and therefore their day is broken up a little bit differently. We recommend having this conducting this during a normal time, quote unquote normal. So maybe not in the next couple weeks as we all scramble and have disruptions in our day with the coronavirus going around. That's probably going to skew some of our results on the time and motion study. You can't plan for any outbreaks, and God forbid you have one, but that wouldn't be a good representation of your time. So we want to say a longer time frame equals more data, which is better. However, sometimes we know that there's constraints on that as well. And then the how. How do we conduct a time and motion study? There's two basic ways, and we'll walk through both of them in just a minute. But really, you want to say whatever's the easiest way for you and your facility to go through and to calculate where people are spending their time as they go through the day. So some of the challenges that we've seen through time and motion study data collection is that everyone wants to allocate and assign, specifically what time to every tiny activity. And sometimes this is where complexity in our activity codes hinders us a little bit. So sometimes we say we want 30 activity codes, so we'll have biosecurity, we'll have animal health care, we'll have animal health care, on rainy days or on sunny days, when really those could all be rolled into one single activity code of animal health care, and we can distribute that based on the same allocation method. So we don't necessarily want to make it too complex, but we do want to customize to what your institution is seeing. Again, with the irregular activities on the when, we'd understand, summertime might be a little lighter, but maybe fall or spring is better suited for what you see as an accurate representation of your species. And then on the how, when we walk through, and I'll just move to the next slide, when we talk about the two types of time and motion study, there's going to be a lot of QA no matter which type that your institution goes with, whether it's this paper-based tracking or the imputed hours. But what you want to do is try to minimize the amount of review that you're doing. So looking at the two types of time and motion study, we recommend one is the traditional paper-based tracking, where everyone carries a sheet with them or they fill it out at the end of the day that says, I spent 4 hours on animal health care with the non-human primates. And then that can be tracked. One problem, or one issue rather, with the paper-based tracking is sometimes the exercises aren't completed in their in their entirety, and we don't have a full working day's worth of hours captured for that day. There's going to be a lot of data entry if you're using an actual piece of paper. If you have a computer that everyone could use, that makes it a little bit easier, but there's still that QA and review of the time to make sure everyone put it in correctly. And sometimes, a lot of the times we see with the time and motion paper study is that leadership and management will go back and need to kind of adjust the hours because maybe the exercise wasn't explained in the best way, or it wasn't detailed properly, or it didn't capture the time as they see. Some of the pros of using a paper-based tracking and letting people really understand where their time is going is that you might find that your resources are doing things outside of what you expected them to do. So talking to that operational efficiency, it does give a little bit of light on where time is being spent by your facility resources. And then the second type of time and motion study is more of an imputed hours, and UCLA actually conducted both of those, so I'll ask them to speak to that in just a minute. But imputed hours is where those supervisors that are overseeing your resources really kind of give an estimate of what hours their people are doing on a day-to-day basis, what they've seen, what they've worked with. They're working most closely with these resources, therefore have the best idea, and it does take away, it is a quicker turnaround for the time and motion study because to get 4 weeks of data, you don't have to wait 4 weeks to collect that data as you would with the paper copy. Again, the con, sometimes we might overlook tasks that people are completing because we aren't aware of it. You might have someone multitasking and getting a couple things done at the same time, and you just think they're doing one at a time. So really what the time and motion study is answering is, where does the salary go? Where does someone's salary kind of play out based on their activities and their species breakout? So a quick overview of how we use that, basically where our salary goes. Example, one $30,000 salary in fringe, 90% of their time is spent doing cage washing. The other 10% is a general administration fee. Of that cage washing, 40% and 60% delineation between mice and rats, breaking out. So the mice would carry $10,000 of the salary, the rats 16, and then this all species category would carry 3,000. And what the all species is that means we know that this calculation or this amount of money is generally spread over all of the species, and therefore each species will cover a proportionate amount. There's multiple allocation methods that we can put this $3,000 to. It could be the census data. It could be direct costs. It won't be the time and motion study because we don't do, if general administration typically is not assigned to a specific species. This slide is one other thing you can look at in your time and motion study, and I know UCLA looked at this pretty closely, is to understand where the time is really going. So you might have an assumption that a lot of your time and your resources time is being directed towards that animal welfare and the standard of care. And you might find that your general administration is astronomically higher than you thought. So it is a good, not just looking at the time and motion study in terms of filling out a rate calculation, it is a good operational tool to have to know where everyone is spending their time. And maybe you can start adjusting things. If you have a larger training bucket, you can understand why someone is needing so much training or why the team needs so much training. And maybe there's some things you can work through their facilities. If maintenance is a high thing, maybe you can start directing some attention to that as well. So it quantifies kind of what everyone is doing in a general day over however long a duration it is. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandra and Jeff and Leanne, if you have anything, to talk through their time and motion study. They did it in a fairly unique way that I hadn't seen before, but I really appreciate their insight on it.
Okay, so this is Jeff here. So time and motion studies. So I don't know how many of you have gotten into philosophical discussions on how valuable time and motion studies are. I will say that I have, unfortunately. And so is Leanne. I think we got in one together, right? So there are different ways to capture this information that obviously you need to use in a model when you're doing rate setting. So you have to capture this information some way. And my experience is that the traditional time and motion study, that's my experience, is that that's what's been used most places that I've been. It's what's been used at UCLA. So the one thing about that, I think, many of us use it, but I think also many of us might feel a little, we might wonder how accurate that really is. And something about the time and motion studies, like when you start, I just want to comment that when you start these, like a rate setting study, like what we've been talking about here today, there is one big assumption that people make, and that's that, that the people that you have are what you actually need, to do that work. We started with Huron. We had, 20 people doing mouse care. That's going to be an assumption that you actually need 20 people to do mouse care. So you have to be really confident that that's true, and so you have to do something to make sure that you are confident with that. I guess putting it another way, the time and motion, the traditional time and motion worksheets, if you give someone a worksheet, I think most people are going to account for 8 hours of their time in a day. That may not really be true, but I don't know that there are too many people that are going to tell you, well, I actually only work 6 hours today. Not too many people are going to be honest like that. So you do kind of have to, I think, if you can, come up with maybe a way just to verify that the time and motion data that you're getting is true. And so actually at a different institution that I've been at, someone introduced kind of a different way of doing this. And Sandra's going to talk more about how we did that. But it's basically kind of a first step before, again, you start with this assumption when you're doing a rate setting study like this, you start with the assumption that you have exactly the FTE that you need to do the job. There's really a step before that where you want to, for certain types of workers that do kind of repetitive things, repetitive tasks, there is a way to kind of really capture how much time it really takes to do certain things, and then from that you can kind of calculate how many FTE you need to do, you need for the work that you do. And I think that's an important step, and Sandra's going to talk more about how we did that process. Or Leanne, are you going to comment?
Just a quick comment to back what Jeff was saying is that with our previous time and motion studies, the paper forms, we tried customizing them for different types of employees. So health techs would receive one type of time study form, the husbandry technicians would receive another one, admin, and so on. And the challenges that we had there were, as Jeff was saying, they want to make sure that they're reflecting an 8-hour day, even though there might be some non-productive time categories for them to put in vacation or sick. We weren't confident that the data reported was accurate, either due to not fully understanding how to record their time, or they might just check a coworker's time and copy what they had put down. And so we had some challenges with that.
So for those employees doing repetitive tasks, such as husbandry employees changing cages or providing husbandry for larger species, we knew that we had to do something different. And what we did is we created a list of tasks based on species and function. And then we, most of the lists were composed on 4 categories. For example, for mice, it was the category of cage change, the category of animal and room check, vivarium support, and vet care. And within these categories, we list specific tasks that the husbandry technicians do. For example, setting up the room, completing do a partial cage change or a full cage change or spot change, and so forth for cage changing. For room and animal checking category, it was mainly about doing those daily health checks, cage by cage, also posting the health cases, checking the environmental records, and doing the housekeeping of the room. And we also have the category of vivarium support. I was very glad that we had a lot of information that we were able to track, because in this category, we included the tasks related to receiving new orders of animals, how much time it takes to process a transfer, whether you are the sender or the receiver, how much time you spend putting facility travel tickets, euthanasia, and then the veterinary care category was all related to health cases. So once we had those task lists developed, then we identify observers. And this was very critical for us because, as Natalie said, sometimes when you start collecting times from the employees, there are perceptions that are not necessarily positive. So what we did was to involve the supervisors and some of the lead technicians and invite them to be observers so that they will understand the process better and somehow mitigate that the bad perception. So we used 3 observers per task, and the time that it took to complete this was significant. So it was about 4 months for us to collect all the data, and the time really varied based on the task. So we, for example, for cage change, we wanted to be able to time average employees. We didn't want the rock stars. We didn't want employees that might not be at the top of the performance. We just want average employees. And maybe observing for 20 minutes was not enough for some of these tasks. Some of these tasks require hours of observation, which was great because also the observers were encouraged to take notes. And this really helped us truly understand our operations, the variabilities between buildings and functions, and also allow us to identify opportunities to improve efficiency. So once all this data came, we decided what was our standard in terms of how many cages an employee can change based on our situation. So one variable that was very critical for us was the type of caging. In this campus for rodents, we mainly have 3 types: static, non-disposable ventilated, and disposable ventilated. And based on all the work that we did collecting data, we were able to determine how many full-time employees we need based on census for this type of caging. So once we determined that, that was the data that we provided to Huron. So what Natalie and Katie received from us was a list of employees with the percentage of time that takes them or that they devote to each one of the cost centers that they had established. And one thing that was important for us is that we also were allowed to give these employees flexible time, which for us is that time that the employees are going to spend doing training. A lot of them do compliance one way or the other, even if it's just receiving an inspector into the room. So we were able to also allocate time for this type of cost centers, which at the end made it into the general administration cost center. So it was by the time Huron came and we were able to provide that data, we were confident that the number of full-time employees that we had in place and the vacancies that were open, it was exactly what we needed to be able to function. So I think that that's kind of like a very brief summary of the methodology that we use for the time in motion of those husbandry technicians. So
Thank you. I think that was pretty sophisticated methodology, and we hadn't seen it, and that's why we wanted to highlight it today with the participants on the call. UCLA, unless you have something else, I think we'll just sort of finalize. We have a couple more slides that we want to speak to and have our. So
go ahead.
The rate calculation.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So the results of the calculated rates, as you can see here, they're highlighted in gray. So this really is the output of the per diem rate study. You compare it to, the current rates that you'd be using or here we're being charged. And then over to the right, you can see the subsidized rate, which is ultimately the decision of what the rates were going to be used and charged out at. And in between there, you can also see some ranges of benchmarks that were provided for the various species. So again, seeing, if you look at total costs, you're seeing that the mice are making up, the majority of the cost for the facility. And then when you look at, like the swine per se, you can see that being one of those species that may be drawing a good amount of expenses, but the care days being so low is going to cause that calculated rate to be on the higher end. So when talking about subsidizing individual species and keeping competitive with markets, you can see between the difference between what was calculated, what was currently being charged, and then the subsidized rate that was agreed upon. Something to keep in mind when looking at the rate schedule that we just had on the screen is those provisional rates. We've spoken to those to these throughout the presentation that sometimes you're going to have species that aren't present, especially when you are conducting that time and motion study. So they're going to require a workaround or a provisional rate. Because there is no way to quantify the daily effort or expenditures related to those species in that snapshot that you're using to complete the study. So workarounds for provisional rates would be, determining a reasonable cost basis to estimate that per diem rate. So sometimes estimating rates based on calculated rates for a species that's similar, that requires a similar level of expenses and salary-related support, and utilizing benchmarking to understand rates at peer institutions to ensure those rates are competitive. So, the example I pointed out, the swine, what we calculated versus really what's going to be competitive in the market, there was quite a variation between the two. One thing to keep in mind, which we had a lot of discussion around in this engagement and in others, is when you look at benchmarking, peer rates, may not be accurate or cost-based. So thinking that, unless you know that a cost rate study had been conducted at that institution, the rates you're seeing posted could be something that is outdated or has been just being, adjusted with a market-based percentage. There's differing structures of animal research operations. So again, going back to that standard of care, what services are being, offered or covered, and that per diem rate can vary from one institution to another. Inconsistent treatment of costs between institutions. And the post-it rates are not going to account for the volume of institutional subsidies required to support the animal research operations. So you may see what the rate is that's being used, but that doesn't tell you that that's actually the true costed rate. So those are things to keep in mind, you know, benchmarking, wanting to ensure you're looking at apples to apples. It is good to, you know, see what the peer institutions, again, for that competitiveness in the market and when looking at some of these provisional rates and such, but things to keep in mind when comparing and looking at what one institution's charging to another.
Thank you, Kari. I think with that, you know, people have had a chance, I think, maybe to put in questions. We have a couple of questions right now that we'll answer. The first one that came in was, if I can just summarize the questions generally, is the first one basically wants to know within the per diem rate calculation how you should treat travel for things like the ALAS or fees like the ALAC, how those get treated in the animal per diem calculation. That, I guess we could talk generally how Huron would put them in, and maybe if UCLA wanted to, you know, talk to, I guess, compliance costs in general, that would be helpful.
Sure. So generally, how we would treat those costs would be including them in the per diem rate, and they would most likely be aligned in that general administration bucket because those accreditations are, you know, facility wide. And so then that's going to get allocated based on, you know, total expenses across the facility. It could also be seen as compliance, and depending at the institutional level, if that's something that you are wanting to directly subsidize, then that would be something you could carve out of the rate structure. But we see no compliance issue in including them in that general administration bucket. And I don't know, Jeff, if you guys had any other insight you wanted to add to that answer.
This is exactly how we handle it. So you explained it perfectly.
Okay.
Next question was just asking, you know, generally about when you should do rates, especially in particular if you're standing up a new facility, if we had any recommendations for that. I would say that we have assisted another institution where they had a brand new facility, and we helped them, you know, sort of develop some pro forma rates using estimates of, you know, based on their budget, and required them to go back and do some budget analysis. And so I think that's probably what I would start right away to develop a model and to, you know, develop, I think, a pretty comprehensive budget and try to use that to estimate rates.
Yeah, this is Jeff. Yeah, I would say that obviously a rate setting study is something that most of us do probably every couple of years, right? But I would say yes, my opinion is if there's a major change in your operation, certainly starting a new facility, you know, the configuration of the facility, what the staffing needs, all of that's going to change with a brand new facility. Hopefully, be more efficient, and with that will be reflected in the rates. But I would say anytime you have some major change like that, I would think you would want to go through sooner rather than later a rate setting study.
Yeah. Because the one compliance issue we have seen is where institutions don't have cost-based rates or they haven't done a study. Then if the government were to come in and review those rates for whatever reason, the fact that you don't have any documentation as to how you came up with your rates, or the documentation is using, you know, sort of the school next door, that has not proven to be a response that the government would accept. A couple more questions. Wanted to know if we have an activity code for facility and warehouse management, or how we categorize those costs. I mean, Natalie, do you want to talk to that, or Kari?
Sure, I can take this one. Generally, if the institution is seeing high costs in a certain area, that you would want to see the facility and warehouse costs stand alone and understand what portion of a per diem rate is allocated from that. So where that money that the species is carrying is coming from that facility and warehouse management. You can break it out into its own activity code. There's no rule or guideline, or not rule. There's no kind of defined number of activity codes. You can have as many as you want. Just remember, if you're allocating the same way, sometimes it's easier to condense those into similar allocation methods. So two that are being allocated by census detail that are similar to each other, you might just want to include in the same one for simplicity. But if you do want that transparency to show that our facility and warehousing costs create additional money for, or the portion of the species are carrying that money, that's a good way to just kind of communicate that out.
Thank you. Do we have any recommendations for a small facility that might only have 1 or 2 species? Maybe Kari?
I mean, I would say everything we've gone over would apply in terms of, you know, the rate calculation, the approach to it. It's probably not going to be as large of an undertaking or timely exercise to go through the time and motion study or some of these other areas that we stressed upon that could get a little bit more complex. But I would think you'd want to follow, you know, for compliance reasons, the same methodology. I think it'll just be a quicker and easier process to go through the rate calculation.
Thank you. Another question about technical services. Should they be subtracted from the total cost? And I guess that goes back to the standard of care. So maybe we could talk to that a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, any technical services or anything that's being billed above and beyond your per diem rate definitely should be carved out, as we've mentioned before. And so there's going to be 2 pieces of that. There's going to be the salary related costs and then any expenses. So oftentimes throughout the rate calculation process, that they may be embedded. So you may see that you have accounts or expense codes that are using like supplies and such. And so you may have to pull invoices if, you know, it may be manual to be able to see what was directly billed versus what are the expenses or supplies related to costs that you are including in that per diem. So you would want to differentiate those and then carve out anything that is being direct billed. And then again with salaries. So again, throughout that time and motion study, that's a way to capture that. So when you have, you conduct that study, you'll see what, you know, portion of times attributable to those activities that you are billing out. And so then you will make a deduction of the salaries based upon that time and motion study results.
Thank you, Kari. So we have one more question and one follow-up, and I think we'll be pretty much at time at that point. So the major differences between rates between rats and mice. Any thoughts on that, Natalie or Kari?
I guess what comes to mind initially would be if for some reason they are using some type of different feed or bedding, which is not always the case. Lots of times they are using the same. I've also seen, depending upon the cages being used, that the cage time or cage wash time could be lengthier for the rat cages. I don't know, Natalie, is there anything else coming to mind initially?
I would just say the size of the cages as well. So we've seen there's sometimes more mice per cage than we see for rats. So it would just be kind of the space that's needed, and then to Kari's point, the cage washing time based on how many cages are there.
I can tell you from our time in motion studies, considering static cages for rats, the frequency of change is higher for rats. We change twice a week, and that is the highest frequency we have. So that definitely made an impact on labor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then just a clarification for per diem rates for the compliance for if they travel to attend a conference, where that would be included, if it's part of the per diem rates or not.
So yes, that would be included in the per diem rates, and an activity such as attending a conference, we would typically assign that to the general administration bucket. And then that would get allocated based on total expenses per species.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining the call today and participating. And I'd also like to thank UCLA for, providing their insights into the process, what they went through with Huron, and kind of the approach that they took to the time and motion study, which is one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this webinar today, was to sort of share that learning or experience that we had with them. So with that, I think we'll sign off. And for one last comment, I guess Huron is providing long form training, which is for people that do the indirect cost in June 15 to 17. If you have people that are interested, appreciate if you'd push it out to people that might to look to sign up. So thanks a lot.